I'm Pat Aufderheide. I'm in the School of Communication, and it is my great pleasure to work on various projects here with wonderful people at the law school like Christine Farley. And it is just a real pleasure and an honor to be here with people whose knowledge of the topic we're going to discuss is very deep, unlike my own. What we're going to be talking about today is an emerging phenomenon in internet domains, which is what some people are calling the walled garden. So this is, does anybody remember, is anybody old enough like me to remember the term walled garden from the days of AOL? AOL heyday, there you go. So in those days, AOL was promising you that it was going to provide you a safe place to be on the internet. And it would offer you everything you really wanted to do, kind of a proto-Facebook, if you want. It would let you, it would give you the kinds of things you wanted to do by showing you what you wanted. And it would, of course, limit its offerings to things that were AOL or AOL associated. And it actually, things turned out differently than what AOL had in mind. But that was then, and now this term has arisen, and it arises in a whole new context. And it might or might not mean something different, but it certainly has to do with with registries creating terms within which anybody who participates, their registrars, their registrants, share certain common terms. So I think that the goal today, in following in Christine's excellent footsteps here, to have a productive conversation among people who have differing views on this same phenomenon. We're going to start out finding out the basics. In this new environment, this term that has arisen, walled garden, what does it mean to the different panelists here? Now, everybody, I hope, has a bio sheet, because these people have led awesome lives and have an amazing position on the internet. So there's no point in my spending the entire panel reading their bios. I'm going to first turn to Becky Burr to address this question, walled garden what?
So when I talk about walled gardens, I will have to say I'm a gardener. I live in a place with a lot of deer, and I think walls are great, and that's what I think of a walled garden is. But I know that's not what you're talking about. But I think that it's critical to contemplate this as it means something different to everybody. We used to talk about a .kids, for example, as a top-level domain that would have been a walled garden where content in that area was essentially, it was moderated content, and it was reviewed and deemed appropriate by some standard for children, and it was an available, safe space where people who were inside the walled garden were known and supposed to be inside the walled garden, and people who might take advantage of people inside the walled garden couldn't come in. That was one form of walled garden. I think lots of us have had a lot of experience trying to make that kind of a walled garden work, and it hasn't worked all that well. There are other walled gardens which are more general. It's open to anybody to come in to register a name, but there are certain rules that we have here. So if there's a dispute about a registration, then my rules as the registry that's operating this space are that, I take it down in my own discretion, or I have a trusted notifier who tells me whether it's a violation of some kind of standard, or I have a third-party process that provides due process. That sometimes when we're talking about walled gardens, people will talk about that as a walled garden. I think other flavors of walled gardens are, I am a very large bookseller, and I run .books and sell books that I publish, and only that only I publish. And I think the variety goes on. So I think it's pretty hard to make general statements about whether walled gardens are good or bad, because it depends a lot on what you mean and how you operate them.
Okay, and Sarah Deutsch, are closed generics, are they walled gardens? And give us a notion of what a closed generic is.
Is this on? Oh, here we go. So talk about closed generics as walled
Are
gardens.
they walled gardens?
Well, to me, it really depends what we're talking about when we talk about the garden. So if the garden has high walls, it doesn't allow other people in, and there's bad activity happening inside that space, and it's restricted to one competitor, for example, and not to others, then perhaps that would be an example of a closed generic that is walled off. There are other spaces Becky mentioned that might just be regulated. So they might have requirements before they let people in. That could also possibly be a walled garden. But I would say generally, and we can get into this more when we talk about closed generics, but a closed generic is usually a closed space where somebody is taking a word from a language, a generic word, and taking it out of circulation, and they're saying, I'm the only one who has exclusive rights. The domain name system operates by means of scarcity, so it only allows one person to operate that domain name, but you're essentially giving them the right to take a generic word and then have exclusive rights over running it and who gets in or out of that space.
So L'Oreal wants .beauty.
Yeah.
Okay. Kathy Kleiman, walled garden.
I was hoping Christine could help us change the slides. Thanks. So we put up a slide here just about the variety of new gTLDs. So you can see new gTLDs in different languages: Chinese, Arabic, Hebrew, Cyrillic, as well as geos, .paris, .london, .nyc, brands, Google, Ericsson, Gucci are all on there. And those serving wide groups that involve interests, hobbies, all sorts of things: cooking, art, shop. So I just wanted, I just wanted to show a little bit about kind of this great promise of new gTLDs as we're switching slides. These are all gTLDs that have been delegated, that were applied for and delegated. But this is my slides, some quick slides, in part because there's a lot of material about walled gardens. Okay, so we didn't have walled gardens when ICANN was founded. We agreed that the internet was a public resource, and the Government Advisory Committee even told us that management of a gTLD was in the public interest. That was a 1999 communique. And when I was director of policy for .org about a decade ago, and Alexa Rad has left now, but she was my CEO, we took very seriously our role as stewards of the internet. As registries, we were responsible for the security and stability of the top-level domains. We protected the internet infrastructure, and we took down domain names that were abusive, but they were abusive to the infrastructure, malwares, botnets. We stayed away from content, because how did we know what's content infringement on site and absent due process? We also the laws on content differ all over the world. What's legal and protected under the First Amendment in the United States can be illegal and criminal in China, such as pro-democracy websites. We felt it wasn't our job to be judge, jury, and executioner on content. And around the same time, the country rejected SOPA and PIPA, the idea that law enforcement could ask to block access to an entire internet domain name due to infringing content based on a single post or web page. And so we protected speech, domain names, and due process. But a funny thing happened on the way to the new gTLD program. And ICANN thought they needed a place to put compromises after communities and governments raised questions and negotiated through the ICANN board, actually, on changes to new gTLDs. We needed a place to put them. And so ICANN decided to open up the contracts, the registry agreements that ICANN signs with the registries to certain voluntary commitments that the registry agreed to make. But registry applicants slid a lot of other stuff in there, and for some reason, ICANN let them.
Do you want this one?
I would like the next slide, please.
Okay, got it. Sorry, I don't know how to.
I'm going to talk about it. Okay, so registry, I've been told to keep talking. So registries adopted these voluntary public interest commitments that aren't public interest at all. And don't protect the public or the registrants in many cases. So Donuts, as has been mentioned earlier, big portfolio applicant, over 250 top-level domains, wrote its voluntary commitments to protect rights protection mechanisms beyond the consensus policies, beyond what you were hearing in panel 1. This is the panel I was really supposed to be on. They created a protected marks list that allows a trademark owner to block their trademark in the trademark clearinghouse across all of Donuts' top-level domains. This was actually policy negotiated and rejected by the ICANN community. They went on, and I just put this up so you don't think I'm kind of making it up. So, read it at your leisure. I'm happy to send you the slides. But the one I love is registry operator. This is Donuts across all its top-level domains. Registry operator reserves the right, at its sole discretion, at any time, without limitation, to deny, suspend, cancel, or transfer any registration or transaction, or place any domain name on registry, lock, hold, etc., including to comply with the terms of this registry agreement and the registry operator's anti-abuse policy, and also to protect intellectual property. And in another place it says to protect against the infringement of any copyright or trademark. Again, beyond ICANN consensus policies, we're creating a walled garden where across 250 top-level domains, many of which are very general, suddenly have their own content rules. Minds and Machines, which is the next slide. I got it.
Sorry.
This is just quick. It kind of has the same acceptable use policy, but then goes on to say that they'll work constructively with law enforcement to address reported cases of abuse. What law enforcement? Where are they? What jurisdiction? Pursuant to what due process? Based on mere allegation? And trust me, law enforcement asks registries to do a lot of things based on mere allegation. It looks like the registry is reserving to itself across many top-level domains the right to do anything it wants with the content. So what's really interesting, and again, I'm covering a lot of stuff in a short period of time, is ICANN has a limited mandate. And we were really excited with the transition from the US government that ICANN's new bylaws very expressly adopted a very clear mission. Article 1, mission, commitments, and core values. The mission of the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers is to ensure the stable and secure operation of the Internet's unique identifier system, and ICANN shall not act outside its mission. ICANN shall not regulate services that use the Internet's unique identifiers or the content that such services carry or provide outside the scope of Section 1.1a. But a funny thing happened on the way to the bylaws, the revised bylaws. And every lawyer in the room will love this language. Whoops. Notwithstanding any provision of the bylaws to the contrary, we're adopting and embracing everything that was in these voluntary, not so public interest commitments. And we're embracing things that look a lot like it in future registry agreements. So a question for the panel and for everyone is, what's left of ICANN's multi-stakeholder model, and what continuing role does ICANN serve? Sorry, tough questions for today, but that's these walled gardens, these creations of content rules within a top-level domain. And I'll give it to Jeff, who I know has a differing opinion.
So, Jeff, the picture that Kathy Kleiman has painted here is rather bleak. And is that your understanding of what a walled garden strategy would be?
No, in short. And Kathy and I have had many conversations about this. But first thing I do want to say is I am one of the co-chairs of the subsequent procedures policy development process, which is working on the policies for the next round. My job there is to be neutral and run that in a neutral manner. So the viewpoints I'm expressing today are my own or my company or my company's, but not necessarily the way that the policies are going to turn out. So I don't want anyone to think that because I'm going to voice some strong opinions that that's the policies going forward. So a couple things, and Kathy really has given a lot, but what I'm going to talk about are points that are a little bit different than the way Kathy has put it. So if you look at what the original policy behind the new gTLDs was, or were, policies were, it was one of the reasons was to promote competition in the provision of registry services, to add to consumer choice, market differentiation, and geographical and service provider diversity. One of those elements, and we have to think about, there are two types of communities for which we need to promote choice. There's the registrant community, and those are people that would like to register domain names. But as Griffin pointed out on the last panel, and Brian, there are also the ultimate end users of the space who may or may not also be registrants. So when I think of walled gardens, there are three types I think of what's been mentioned. The first are registries that have restrictions, or otherwise called validated top-level domains, that they only allow certain entities in if they meet certain restrictions, and they kick them out if they don't. The second type is closed generics, which, as was said, was taking a generic word, or what may be a generic word, and using it solely within your own organization or your own organization's affiliates. And then the third issue I think we kind of talked about being walled gardens are the ability to take down names that are believed to be violation of your policies. I can make an argument, and will during this panel, that all three of those can and are good things. And the thing kind of as a generic type of comment is, when you look at organizations now that are facing increasing scrutiny for the content that is delivered over their system or through their platform, the heat on these organizations is getting very high. Whether it's Facebook being criticized for allowing deceitful misinformation, fake news being dispersed throughout their system, or in this case, whether it's a domain name registry that is being criticized for allowing an increasingly number of abusive domain name registrations. You have to also take a look at this from the side of those entities. I wish I could say, and I helped run a registry for a number of years, I wish I could say it was as easy as being able to kind of say, yep, we don't regulate content, that's it, we're stepping out of it. But when you work for these registries, and when you see some of the things that I've seen, including child pornography, including imminent threats of harm, including such obvious counterfeiting and distribution of movies and music, when things are that obvious, and you know that if you allow that activity to exist, then you will be criticized for having that activity through your platform, then the choice and the decision of whether to take down that content is not as simple as we don't look at content and therefore we let it go. And I have seen actual threats against human life, car bombs, and other types of things. And you know what? All of us, we're human beings. And you know what? If I see something that looks like an actual threat to imminent life, I'm going to take it down and take the heat for taking it down, because I'd rather take that heat than take the heat of some actual act that was actually committed and someone died. So not all situations are that extreme, but not everything is as easy as saying we don't touch content, let's move on. Thanks.
So your three categories for walled gardens would be content regulation at the registry level.
No, I wouldn't say taking the ability to have policies like what Kathy was mentioning, reserving rights to take down names that violate certain policies, right? So it's post registration.
Okay.
So there's three types. One is closed generics, which is an organization having and deciding on keeping that name for its own organization. And I'm sure-
Amazon, beauty.
Well, not .amazon, but Amazon having something like .book.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Right?
Yes, sorry.
And then the second type would be like a .pharmacy, .bank, which are restricted and only allow certain entities in. That's prior to allowing domain registrations. And then the third is a post-registration takedown process for abusive domain names or violations of policies.
Correct. Okay. So, Mitch Stoltz, is that categorization making sense to you to define what we're talking about today? And if so, how are you positioning yourself so people can understand your take on this?
So I may be fighting the hypo here, but I'd actually like to get away from this question. Is something a walled garden or not? Because we could come up with a definition, which would take us weeks, and then we argue about who's in and who's out, and that would take us weeks. As a concept, it's useful because it's useful to talk about gatekeepers of speech on the internet, of which there are many varieties. And it was actually really interesting that Jeff mentioned Facebook because that's the one that sort of on the public policy level and academic and just as individual human beings we are all really wrestling with right now, and that's that Facebook has an incredible amount of power over who gets to speak and who will hear it and what subjects can be discussed, and everybody has a different opinion about how they should do it. Some people think Facebook, Facebook's content moderation is biased against conservative viewpoints. Some people think they're allowing too much sort of false news. Some people think they should categorize their advertisements differently, right? But Facebook is a private company, so nobody really disputes their right and ability to moderate and to make those decisions, although we all have an opinion about what's the right way to do it. Now, there are other sorts of gatekeepers. Your ISP can potentially be in the position of a gatekeeper. Your internet service provider can cut you off entirely if they so decide. And then the domain name system is another one, and that's a gatekeeper for anyone who owns a website. Right, and for those who are looking for the open web and looking for an alternative to the mega platforms like Facebook and YouTube, it's still true you can make your own website, right? On which you can put almost anything, and there is no aside from legal process, there's no gatekeeper, there's nobody looking over your shoulder and saying what you can say and what you can and who can hear it. Or is there, right? Because if you have a website, you need a domain name. And if the companies that manage those domain names, and particularly we're talking about registries, I know this name was mentioned, and for people not steeped in the ICANN world, registries are companies that operate the top-level domains. So for every word that comes after the last dot, there is a company that owns and manages that. So .com is managed by VeriSign. 250 odd new domain names are managed by Donuts. There are many others, and they effectively do have the power to make a website disappear by suspending its domain name. Especially if in a time-sensitive situation, that is the power of censorship. Right? They can throw, so just as Facebook can delete your posts, almost at will, a registry can make your website disappear, almost at will. That's why the policies like the one that Kathy showed, are scary to people who care about the open web and about free speech, because this is a private company with its own sort of business motivations and its own sort of independent decision making, exercising arbitrary power over speech. Now, certainly you can say, and this also to Jeff's point, different registries can do it differently, and this is very important, right? I mean, .com really has never historically had policies like this. There may be one-offs, they certainly, I'm sure, will suspend a domain name, on a court order, or if a domain is, being used to operate a botnet or something, things that we think of as technical harms, because we think of those technical harms as part of the administration of the internet, right? If one domain is sending out a whole bunch of spam and slowing down everybody and jamming up everybody else's email box, then maybe a company will shut that domain down. But the further we get from that, the more the registries are starting to look like Facebook in the degree of power that they're wielding over speech and the audiences for speech. And also, the more they do it, the harder it is to stop. So absolutely, any sort of person with a conscience, if working at one of these companies, if they see, a threat to human life, they're gonna go in there and shut it down. But the more we do that, and the more that's done, the harder it is to say no to the next one. And this happened, this is an example not in the domain name space, but something very close to. There's a company called Cloudflare, which is a content delivery network and caching service that basically speeds up websites and insulates them from denial of service attacks. Very large company. The last statistic I heard, they were processing, something like 7% of all web pages, websites in the world had Cloudflare as an intermediary. The number's probably higher by now, but 2 summers ago, the CEO of Cloudflare said, this morning I suspended, this was a neo-Nazi website that was, inciting violence. And he said, and he wrote a very interesting letter. He basically said, I got up on the wrong side of the bed this morning and I made this website disappear. And my conscience told me to do it, but this is a dangerous power for me to wield. And I shouldn't have the power to do that. And it turns out he was right. Like his prediction proved true, because a year later, Cloudflare was sued by a group of record companies for, I believe it was record companies, but copyright holders for supposedly allowing websites, allowing a website to infringe copyright and providing services to that website. And the people that sued them, they said, they introduced that letter that he wrote in court, and they said, look, you've said that you have the arbitrary power to ban Nazis when you get up on the wrong side of the bed. Therefore, you cannot refuse us when we come to you saying we want you to ban pirates. So and then that's an example. So but then if you ban child pornography, you also have to ban the other one that tends to happen is foreign pharmacies. You can't let them operate websites. But it's pretty easy to see where it goes from there, right? Even if we're talking about laws, right? Because there are laws in other countries that say it's illegal to insult the king of Thailand, it's illegal to insult the founder of Turkey. Facebook, at various times in its moderation policies and its army of sort of human post reviewers, actually was enforcing those. But those are rules that in most in the U.S. and Europe and many places, we would consider those laws anathema. And we wouldn't necessarily want to enforce them. You certainly think about Chinese censorship and sort of laws about promoting democracy and so on. Like, it would be a real problem to have a private company, decide on its own initiative to start enforcing those laws. But again, the more we make these policies and these companies reserve to themselves the right to make these policies, the harder it becomes to say no to the next one. That's my concern with walled gardens.
So you're sort of saying it's like having a highway system, and instead of having the highway system be a place that lets people get on and drive. It's a smart highway system, and it says, well, you know, I think you've drunk a little too much, and you're underage, and I'm not sure that you should be visiting your ex at this hour of the day. Is that the kind of thing you're saying?
It is, right? So maybe we want to design a smart highway system that stops people who are trying to escape from a bank robbery. But if you do that, then why not people who are trying to escape from securities fraud, or some people who are trying to escape from, you know, you name it, whatever cause X is, you know, where you may have a huge constituency of people saying, we don't want this, right? Let's deny those people the ability to drive.
So this is, presumably nobody on this panel is pro-child pornography, right? Good. See, we agree on something. It sounds like there are a couple of issues that stand out. One is accountability. If you have a lot of private governance buried within systems, and you have to be able to read some of that legal language that Kathy showed us and understand what it is in order to understand what the implications are of going to a donuts registry rather than somebody else. Like that's unaccountable private power in a certain way, or Potemkinly transparent private power. But so there's that account. But then there's also a jurisdictional question. Like, presumably we all think there should be some kind of regulation of bad behavior, right? Somewhere. But is it at the ICANN level? Is it at the registry level? Is that, do people think that those are fair questions to ask? Okay. Becky wants a word.
Well, I think they are fair questions. And I'm just going to say to Kathy, like everything at ICANN, the PICs, grandfathering the PICs is all my fault.
So PICs is the private
interest commitments. No, but
public
just
interest
a joke.
commitments that were voluntary.
I am on the board of ICANN. I am now speaking entirely on my personal behalf. But I think we're conflating enormous numbers of issues here, and it is making me very nervous. So I just want to take a step back. I think that we can all agree that the things that threaten the infrastructure and cause technical harms are, I think everybody's conceded those are fair game. There's no state, when the registries, these PICs that Kathy put up there were commitments that private companies made because they thought it would help them get their domain name. Now, I can tell you that I hope we never see anything like that, that the process by which that happened was appalling, and most registries and registrars were appalled by the process as well. It has created...
Because it was appalling, because why?
Because it was a reaction to anxiety on the part of, legitimate anxiety on the part of governments about how are consumers going to be protected in this, and a potential crackdown on the ability to apply for domain names. So a subset of registry applicants came in and made these public interest commitments that were like literally everything in the kitchen sink. They just threw everything in it. From a governance perspective, my view was that ICANN should never have agreed to those because enforcing them was a huge problem. Now, I can address this problem by outsourcing the enforcement of it, and maybe that's worked and maybe it hasn't. But the companies did make all of these contractual commitments in a bid to outcompete others. I do have a real problem, fundamental problem, with having allowed people to make those commitments in order to get a competitive advantage, that we're going to walk away from them and saying, they're not enforceable. And so when we grandfathered the existing public interest commitments into the new bylaws. It was a kick the can down the road. We've got to figure out a way to deal with this, and hopefully, Jeff, and we won't have, endless kitchen sink picks in the next round, but who knows what will happen in the next round. But I personally do have a problem with this. I'm gonna make a promise to get a competitive advantage, and then I'm not gonna do anything about it. But the other thing is, Mitch said something about it's important that there are a lot of registries. I mean, if there are a lot of registries and they can all set their rules in different ways, then maybe it's not such a big problem, and maybe we shouldn't be so anxious about it. And then I'm just gonna, and I promise I'll stop talking, Sarah. But I'm just gonna give you an example of something that I dealt with as a registry operator quite recently that had nothing to do with infrastructure or technical harms. Somebody calls and says, there's something weird going on in these domains. And I look at them, and this is a greatly simplified and actually much less flagrant violation. 100 different sites, all registered by the same person, selling every single breed of dog in the world to American consumers. The site was not based in the United States. And then there also had sites where they were shipping, offering to ship the puppies to anybody who would buy them sight unseen. There was nothing, I didn't go and buy a dog on this, so I could not tell you personally that I was ripped off and paid for shipping and a puppy. But there was no question in my mind, they were scams, and we took them down because they were ripping off consumers. So if you can tell me, I think it's critical that people be able to exercise that kind of judgment where consumer harms are involved. And I think particularly in a place where there's no state action, and the scammers can go and register in some other site if they want to, and somebody who thinks that's important speech can protect it, but I didn't think that was my job, and I wasn't comfortable with doing it. And I don't think, and I'll stand up and defend, anybody's speech rights, but not when it comes to ripping off consumers or running puppy mills for that matter.
Sarah.
Thanks. So I'm on the board of both ICANN and EFF, so I'm going to give a giant disclaimer that I'm speaking for myself. I see both sides of this issue. On one hand, I don't think it's surprising that we see contractual provisions where registries and registrars have terms of service that prohibit trademark and copyright infringement and other abuses and say they have the right to take action. So we see all sorts of third-party sites with these exact same provisions, ISPs, and in fact, under the DMCA, if you're a service provider, which is basically any website, you have to take the content down expeditiously or you could risk losing your safe harbor. So there's a liability issue at play. So I don't see the fact that it's in the contract that surprising. I also think in the bigger picture scheme, we need to recognize that we're in a different era now, like Jeff said, where there's more pressure on whether it's platforms, ISPs, and it could be registrars and registries to take a greater fiduciary duty over what's happening on their website. This is especially true for fake news, for interference with elections, threats against journalists, and there's privacy breaches, and there is a real risk and discussion that Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which gives immunity to publishers who publish third-party content, there's a risk that could be taken away or weakened. So I think, and we're seeing calls internationally for greater what they're calling cyber hygiene, but making sure abuse doesn't occur on your platform. And we have academics like Jonathan Zittrain and others talking about notions like information fiduciary. So I would say that there could be increased pressure on the ICANN community to think about the public interest in terms of playing a fiduciary role. So all that said, at the same time, I totally see Mitch's concern and others' concerns about the slippery slope of all of that and what EFF calls shadow regulation, because once you start doing it for one thing, it starts off as something small, it grows into something larger that's outside the scope of the law. So I do think we have to be cognizant about that as well. Thanks.
So Jeff has had many facial expressions over the last few speakers, and I think we should give him a moment.
Thanks. Sorry, I show my expressions on my face most of the time. Yeah, I just want to give an example of, it's interesting now that we're all agreeing that taking down names for malicious activity like phishing, farming, malware, and spam is something that we all accept. Because back in 2005, that was not the case. And so back in 2005, I was the chief legal person for the .biz registry. And I got notified by an organization comprised of ISPs that because of the enormous amount of spam that they saw on .biz, that they were blacklisting every single address, .biz address. So any email being sent to anyone with a .biz address was being blocked. Any email from a .biz address was being blocked. So this basically, .biz showed up on the most abused top-level domains. It killed our reputation. Our numbers started to go drastically down in terms of registrations. Legitimate companies that were using .biz or people that were using .biz were now complaining that their emails weren't going through, they weren't receiving emails. And at the time, .com, so VeriSign was on record for saying this is not anything we're going to do. This is regulation. This is a slippery slope. We are not taking any action on any kind of abusive phishing, farming, malware, spam, any of that. Go to a court, get a court order, and we'll do it. That was the prevailing view. .org was the same way. Everyone was the same way. I went out on a limb and created the first anti-abuse policy of any registry and put it into effect. That effect basically said that once we got a complaint of malware, phishing, farming, spam, we would confirm that that was going on. And so we built a lab environment to do it. And that we would let registrars know that you either have 12 hours to take the name down yourself or we'll do it. And we were seen as pariahs in the community by everybody. We had people coming to us saying we're, shadow regulation, slippery slope. How can you do this? We got threatened by some of the major registries for saying you're making us all look bad by doing this. How could you be doing it? In that year, in 2005, 2006, we took down somewhere in the order of 32,000 domains. Guess how many complaints we got for taking down false domains or domains that weren't used? 0. In the 10 years I was at Neustar and the .biz registry, we got 0 complaints. We took down hundreds of thousands of domains. It was not an easy decision to start this in place, but it took .biz from the most abusive TLD list to one of the safest TLD lists in about a 6-month period. And you know what? We had to do it because our customers were leaving us, and rightfully so. We were not deserving of getting that business, but we turned that around. So I think you need to look at it from many angles. I am so delighted now that everyone is saying that phishing, farming, malware, it's acceptable to take those down, because that was not the case. But I'm happy about that. And I think some of these other examples may convince people that, no, look, we all know about the slippery slope. But just because it can be a slippery slope and lead to things we don't want to touch doesn't mean we should just wash our hands of it, especially as Becky has said, when we know that consumers are being harmed.
Turning to Kathy. Or do you, Mitch, I'm sorry, Mitch, Kathy, do you mind if Mitch takes it and then you have the last word? Okay. And then we're going to questions, so start thinking about that.
Right, I think this isn't, responding to Jeffrey, there is an issue here of norms and of process. And to illustrate that, I'll give another example that's far afield. And that's, do we think that the power company should take upon itself as a matter of good corporate citizenship to combat fraud by receiving complaints from people about fraud, and when they and investigate those complaints, and if they find fraud, cut off somebody's electricity? Who here thinks that's a good idea? It sounds bizarre, right? So for the record, for the folks on the internet, I didn't see a single hand here. And the reason that is that that's not how we, as a society, conceive of the electric company. We don't see that as their role. No matter the electric power is certainly used in the commission of all kinds of crimes, and frauds and harmful activities are enabled by the use of electrical power. They are in fact so the power company is in fact an indispensable component of most criminal conspiracies or fraudulent businesses, and yet we still don't think it's their role. Now, the domain name system, right? I think we certainly have that Norman.com, right? Which is partly why we don't see these sorts of activities going on in .com. These sorts of content regulation happening in .com quite as much. From what Jeff is describing, it sounds like there is at least some segment of internet users who do see some of the new gTLDs like .biz in that role. I don't know that that's a global norm. I certainly don't think that's a norm among what I would call sort of everyday internet users, the person who just wants a personal blog or a website for a small business. I don't know that they're thinking, that they're not lawyers. They're not getting into the fine print, that comes with a domain registration, and they're not thinking, I better choose a top-level domain, with who's that has an arbitration policy that I agree with. Mostly they're choosing because they want one that's catchy and that goes with the name of their business or something like that. Also, once they've chosen it right, it's really hard to change, because you lose potentially all the traffic to your website if you change your address. So whatever policies that registry adopts after you have your domain name are basically out of your control. Long story short, right? The difference here is, what is the norm? Do we as a community decide that, not that we want, that we want people combating fraud? Of course we do. And it's not that, do we want people to stop abusive behavior? Of course we do. The question is, who do we want doing it? What processes do we want them to employ when they do it? And who sets those processes? And are they set by private companies with a profit motive? Are they set through a community process? Are they set through the laws of some relevant jurisdiction? And which jurisdiction is that? Right? These are the questions we're really confronted with. One other little point about on the competition point. It's true that the plethora of new domain names, and I understand there may possibly be many thousands more coming, that gives us the space for competition among policies. But that only works if people understand what they're buying. That only works if the difference between these domains is evident to that ordinary internet user, that person who just wants a personal blog or a small corporate website. Really understands what those differences are, and it also depends on there being real differences. One company, Donuts, owns I think about 1 in 6 of the new top-level domains. And they are, like Kathy said, implementing trademark enforcement policies that were considered and rejected by the ICANN community. But they are still the policy for 1/6 of the new top-level domains because one company decided they wanted them to be. That cuts against this notion of competition, and especially also that if there becomes a race to the bottom with these things, if there is the ability of registries to target constituencies and customers other than registrants and ordinary internet users. If we can say, we are the registry that just wants to please government, so we're going to act on every tip from law enforcement, whether it's been adjudicated or not, or we're the registry that just wants to please trademark holders. So we're going to, confer rights that no trademark law in the world confers, but we will, to please trademark owners.
And your last point.
Once we're in that open season, again, it's hard to come back from it.
Okay, Kathy, wind this up for us before we turn to our questions and answers.
Okay, then, wow, you heard it here first. ICANN has changed in terms of what its scope and mission is. In 1999, 20 years ago, we were, the internet was a public resource, and we were managing top-level domains in the public interest. During the new gTLD program, it looks like, and it's been discussed, that registries took the base registry agreement, an agreement which, by way of background, you should know, we negotiated together. It was part of the negotiation of the rules. And it was the same registry agreement every registry was supposed to sign. It was just supposed to be tweaked a little bit. We allowed in the kitchen sink. That's what Becky told us. We allowed in the kitchen sink things completely outside the scope and mission of ICANN, things completely contradictory, including protections of intellectual property or catering to law enforcement beyond due process that had never been agreed to by the ICANN community. But then we grandfathered it as part of the transition. So ICANN, after 20 years of fighting a world that wanted us to be the content regulator, and we said, no, we regulate the infrastructure. We regulate the layers below the application layer. We don't regulate content, and you don't want us to, because we're global, because we scale, because we run the technical infrastructure. That's no longer the case, I guess. We are now content regulators. The question in Jeff's group is not throwing out these voluntary, not-so-public interest commitments. It's how to get ICANN to enforce them. That's what's going on in the subsequent procedures working group for the next application. I think in exchange for the transition, we got censorship. Thanks. Sorry, that's not a summary.
And turning, I wasn't asking you to summarize. I was just asking you to complete the sequence of speakers. So we're going to we're going to questions. I'm going to give the prerogative to the conference organizer. Okay, sorry, yes. And please say who you are so that the people who are watching this on a webinar can know that too.
Steve Del Bianco with NetChoice, and conversations whipsawing between reducto, absurdo, slippery slope, and conflating enforcement of promises with ICANN changing its policies. Let's try to be more practical, and I'll ask you a practical question. I think Becky quite appropriately pointed out that an applicant made promises and got their domain because of the promises. It was only sensible that ICANN be able to be one of the parties that held them to their promises. NetChoice members make promises all the time on creating a safe platform or space. And it's understood that the FTC and other law enforcement and courts can hold them to promises. So my question would be, when it comes to these closed generics that are run by a single company, if Goodyear got .tires and decided to light up only Goodyear content and bias things like search.tires, winter.tires, and info.tires in a way that biased towards Goodyear's products. If that was completely advertised, Goodyear's logo was on the page, that would probably be okay, but what if it was a subtle bias that went on? So Kathy and I joined arms at ICANN years ago to say, wait a minute, ICANN, you need to stop this from happening. You can't let a single competitor control it. So what happened? We went to the Federal Trade Commission and said, rather than prohibit it ahead of the fact, we'll just watch closely. And if there is unfair and deceptive trade practices, then the U.S. would enforce on it, so that if Goodyear did something like that with .tires, they would go that way. And that is the way that it ended up going at ICANN. There's no prohibition, right?
Yeah, there is.
Yes, there is.
For the purposes of this, competitors do run closed generics today, and they could exhibit bias, but thus far they haven't. So do you think it's appropriate to just address bias, to address unfair practices when it happened, or do you believe you need to preload a prohibition?
Thank you, and we need to get the rest of the questions, and then we will have the panelists deal with the questions. So the first question is preload it or deal with it after the fact. Okay.
Hi, this is Michael Nicholas. So my main research specialization is actually not connected to trademark law. It's on human rights standards and how they should apply to the tech sector. So from that perspective, I'd like to suggest a distinction, because a lot of folks have been talking about Facebook. And I would argue that there is a distinction between Facebook and Twitter, which are platforms that provide a curated experience to their users, and the more infrastructural players like AT&T or Comcast or Alcatel, which is building pipelines to carry internet traffic undersea cables. And I think that there's a conceptual difference between Twitter saying we don't want to have Milo Yiannopoulos on our platform, and or saying we think that this particular Kurdish nationalist organization is a terrorist group and we don't want them there, and Comcast saying we are going to install a filtration system so that nothing that Steve Bannon or Milo Yiannopoulos says can reach any networks of ours. So I think that that difference between the platforms and the more infrastructural players is critical. And so my question to the panel is, do you think that that is a fair distinction? And if so, what side of that ledger would registries fall on? Thank you.
Thank you. Infrastructure or content platform. And behind you is Andrew Renz, who's been waiting, and then Brian. I'm sorry. Oh, did you have a question?
Yeah. Christine Hay-Farley. I wanted to just note for the record that we did invite Donuts to participate. Donuts has been mentioned in both panels, so I just wanted to make that clear. And I wanted to invite the panel to talk about closed generics, which was implicated in the last question. We didn't really have a chance to talk about it yet. And I guess I just wanted to ask, since Becky said, I hope that we don't get kitchen sink picks in the next round. I just wasn't clear on what's being done so that we won't.
Okay, Andrew, and then Brian. And let's be quick.
So, two people get a bit.
Yeah, just go over there quickly. Did you just turn it off? This is working fine. Come here.
Yeah, it's been cut off right at the infrastructure. Thank you. So, I have a blog, and let's say it's hosted, and I registered with one of the generic domain names or the non-curated domain names. I want to know if you're going to decide about the content of my blog, because you're going to get a complaint about it, because you will, from the Intellectual Property Association of South Africa. They don't like what I have to say. You will. So where are the rules? I need to know the rules up front. Like natural justice is, if you're going to go around deciding whether I can speak or not, I'd like to know what the rules are. And then if you've already agreed with ICANN to enforce intellectual property or some kinds of other things, then it's not clear to me that it seems to me you're a biased judge. So you're not an unbiased judge. And then do I get an appeal? So it seems that if we're going to exercise the kind of power that governments exercise, then we want to use natural justice. And then I don't see all the elements of natural justice there. They seem to be missing.
Thank you. And do you want to use this mic?
Sure. I want to say thank you to the panelists, and thank you, Sarah, for making a good point about the kind of balance that the law, at least in this country, has struck between the content hosting providers and their obligations to remove content when something is reported to them in exchange for safe harbor. And I wanted to ask the panel if you think that that is a fair balance, and if it is or isn't, how do you think that balance applies to ICANN and to registrars and to registries?
Thank you. That's it for the questions. And we're going to go run about 10 minutes over the regular time because we started 15 minutes late. All right, why don't we pick up closed generics quickly first and go, Sarah.
Thank you. So I thought I would share one real-world example of an applicant who applied for a new gTLD. They applied as open. It wound up being operated as closed, and it was .bible. So they had content restrictions based on a very specific definition of the word Bible and Word of God as that accepted by Christians. So their definition of Bible in their original policy was that you could register there if you believed Bible was the 39 Old Testament books and 27 New Testament books. And you could register a domain name consistent with that definition. Also, you had to agree to their content restrictions. There was no disparagement or blasphemy of any content that espouses or promotes a religious or secular or, quote, other worldview that is antithetical to the New Testament or non-Christian beliefs. So people who were not Christian, by de facto, were not allowed to, Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, agnostics, atheists were excluded, and even those Christians of different variations, Baha'i Faith, Jehovah's Witness, Mormons, they were also excluded. And as well as, let's not forget trademark owners. There are people who own marks like Style Bible and Fashion Bible and Girl Bible. They could not register in this space. And then on top of all of that, they had a dispute resolution policy. If you wanted to be one of the arbitrators, like, you do UDRPs or other decisions, and you wanted to sign up with .bible, you had to sign an oath that you believe the Bible is the Word of God, which brings salvation to Christ, and agree to a lengthy panelist affirmation. So that, of course, goes against norms. So at the end of the day, I will say that I see their policy has changed. I don't know why, whether that was divine intervention or they saw the light. But either way, super happy that happened. But I think this is a real world example of what happens in a closed generic space, and we need to be mindful and careful of this as this policy goes forward.
And both Kathy and Jeff have their hands up. Go, Kathy, then Jeff.
Really fast. The Bible is a great example. So when you're a closed generic, the registry owns all of the second level domains. And so we agreed to allow brands to do that, not to force IBM or Sony or Ericsson to sell second level domains through the traditional registry, registrar, registrant model. But when we saw the new gTLDs unveiled and looked at their details, there were dozens of closed generics: search, cloud, blog, mobile, book, beauty. Amazon, of course, wanted .book as a closed generic. They would own all the second level domains. With Steve Del Bianco and others, we actually got ICANN to launch a discussion about this. We heard from people, hundreds of comments from across the world saying, no, this isn't good. We reversed it. There are no closed generics now, although some may be operating that way when they're not supposed to be. But it's really, really lucrative to lock up the generic word of your industry or business. And so we're hearing about it. You hear in the subsequent procedures working group about closed TLDs, not just closed generics, that anyone, there seems to be a movement from a working group largely dominated by incumbents that they can do anything they want, and that's really hard.
Okay, Jeff.
I guess I have to defend the working group. The working group didn't just willy-nilly take this issue on. In fact, the board resolution that temporarily restricted closed generics specifically said in the registration that our group was to look at the policy or our group was to determine what the policy should be. So that's what we're doing. We're taking input, deciding what the policy should be. So it's not as if it's a settled issue. It's not that easy. But I can make a lot of cases where a closed generic actually is more beneficial for end users than the generic top-level domain. Again, I used specifically the word end users, not registrants. It may not be fair to registrants, but it may be much better for end users. I'll give you an example, .disaster, okay? It's a generic word, right? Pretty generic. What if the International Red Cross applied for .disaster and said, you know what, we want to control that, and we want to make sure to use it with any natural disaster for which we, the Red Cross, collect donations for, so that everyone in the world knows if you go to a Hurricane X disaster, you are actually contributing to the official disaster fund of the Red Cross. Now, let me ask you, what's more beneficial for end users? That or allowing a company like, I shouldn't say donuts because that's a bad example, allowing a company to just sell willy-nilly .disaster to anybody that wanted it for any reason whatsoever, thinking about the possibility of fraud. Think about that. So it's very easy to say a .mobile example or the .book example. But at the end of the day, who are we looking out for? Registrants? Is there a legitimate right to register any name you want? Is that a fundamental right? Or are we taking a look at what's better for the end user? And I can make a lot of cases for reasons why a closed generic could be a lot more useful and beneficial to end users than the new TLD program registrations right now. I ask how many of you have seen domain registrations in the generic top-level domains in the wild? I probably saw a few. But if a company like Amazon had .book, and they could actually make it so that every author that sells on their platform or every musician, I guess, an audiobook, whatever, could have an official page and that end users could be certain that that's the official page, is that better or worse than just throwing .book out there for anyone to register and no one ever using it and people just redirecting it to different places?
Okay, so I can just see the closed generics are going to eat the rest of the time. So I'm going to say apologies to the other questioners in advance, but stick around for the reception, which is on its way. And let's talk about
Pat,
it there.
Pat, if you don't mind, could I speak to the other questions real fast?
You want to? Okay.
To two of the other questioners, if I may.
I'm delighted to change. There are two people here who want to respond to other issues, and I'm delighted to honor them.
Thanks. Actually, wanted to get to Michael's question. He said that there's a spectrum of different actors who are all potential gatekeepers on the internet, from the infrastructure level to the content level. And I agree, and I would say that yes, the companies in different roles should have different responsibilities and should govern their own conduct a little bit differently. I think that's absolutely true, and that's what I was trying to get at with the power company example. We don't expect. In fact, I think most of us would reject the notion of the power company doing law enforcement or fraud enforcement or some other sort of social norm enforcement through the punishment of cutting off people's electrical power. In order to be good corporate citizens and to protect people. I think most of us would absolutely reject that. A majority of Americans reject that with respect to conduit internet service providers. We know that from the battle over net neutrality. We don't want the company that actually brings the internet into your home to have that sort of decision-making power over content. Now, where do domain name companies fall in that? The norms probably are a little bit more clouded, I think, and I think they vary between communities. But these are important questions that I don't think we're actually wrestling with. Not in that sense. That we're wrestling with them on the technical level, on the level of edits to existing ICANN policies, but that's not a forum where the public, people actually affected by this, I think are actually understanding what's at stake. And then just really quickly on this point about safe harbors, and at the risk of contradicting one of the people who decides if I get a raise, there are two laws that a lot of folks are referring to when they talk about safe harbors. One of them is Section 512 of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, which is specifically about copyright and only applies to certain categories of internet intermediaries. I don't know that a court has ever decided whether domain registries fit into one of those categories. I believe they haven't, but somebody may correct me. The other one is called Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, and that applies to everything but intellectual property. It applies to, it shields a broad category of intermediaries from claims of legal liability arising from things that their users do, and this is things like libel or defamation, other sorts of things that other people do. These two laws together are kind of what made today's internet possible. There is a misconception that moderating content or failing to respond to complaints, outside of this narrow category with Section 512 causes one to lose their safe harbor. That's actually not the law, especially with Section 230. There's a misconception that's being spread around the media right now. Section 230 protects internet intermediaries whether or not they moderate. Protects them from claims arising from somebody else's words.
And summing up. Is that it? Okay, great. Moving on to Becky then. And Becky, you're going to have the last comment for me.
Okay, so I find this utility metaphor, the power company, just sort of odd. Because frankly, if the power company cuts off my heat, I don't have heat, and I probably don't have a choice of where to go, and power companies are utilities. Same thing with the net neutrality, and with the Section 230, the role of registries and registrars is not, it just doesn't fit into that paradigm. They're not offering platforms for the publication of platform. They're running registries.
Well,
really.
Section 230 would apply to
Well, except that, I mean, okay. Theoretically, I don't think that I don't think that it's ever come up. You asked a question, Andrew, that I did want to answer, which is that the DMCA safe harbor isn't really applicable to registries and registrars, but it obviously is a place where if you are running a website and you have content that's infringing, you obviously have to, allegedly infringing, you have to receive a complaint and act on it and the like. It doesn't, when somebody with a copyright issue, alleged copyright infringement, comes to a registry operator, there is no choice for a registry operator to say, take down that piece of infringing content. Now, as to your question about who makes the rules and how do you find out what they are, I want to say with respect to intellectual property, I find that the issue is a lot cloudier and a lot more complicated. And so to agree to your point, most registries and registrars with respect to trademark would say you do a UDRP or a uniform rapid suspension, you go through there. The copyright, we have looked at a number of the trusted notifier systems, and I have not found them to be satisfactorily useful, and there's no real due process associated with them. So I have not found a system that I like and that I think works. That is not to say, however, that I wouldn't like to have a mechanism that really did work, short of, of having to go to court to find a solution for some of the copyright infringement. But the issues that come to my desk really are the consumer fraud ones, not the, and so we are talking about something that requires a whole lot more nuance than we either have time for or have been able to tease out in this discussion. Because the issues with respect to copyright and trademark are not the same, and the issues with respect to what's legal in Thailand and what's legal in the United States are not the same, and the issues about consumer fraud are not the same. And I don't think we've gotten to those. I guess we just have to continue the conversation.
And what a great way to wind this up. I don't feel bad at all that we're unable to have a round of final remarks, because there's no way at this point to seal off this conversation, because these courageous people who came here today launched a conversation that really hasn't been had yet. And it's a big conversation about governance and about location of governance, about regulation and location of regulation, and whether the kinds of ways we are evolving this structure of domain names now deserves more attention and open discussion. And here I want to thank Michael, say it for me. Karanicolis, for raising this issue of transparency, because although transparency is this magic word within ICANN, most of us have no idea what's going on in any of those venues, and we don't understand what's at stake. And I want to thank WCL for launching the discussion that happened here as beginning as it was, and in the earlier panel, and I want to see whether we can begin to continue the conversation at the reception. Thank you.